Welcome to Healing Childhood Trauma, the podcast for millennial women who are ready to heal from the past. Here, we have the deeper discussions on emotional well-being and practical tips that will empower you to transform your relationships and underlying anxiety from insecure to secure attachment. I'm Lizandra, your host and psychotherapist. I'm a little bit obsessed with human development, deep conversations, and finding the lesson even in the most challenging of circumstances. I'm very happy to have you with me on this journey of self-discovery where we unpack the past and heal in the present. Hello, my lovely. I hope you are doing well. Welcome back to the podcast. I wanted to talk about attachment in more of a lighter, more everyday way and the ways that it shows up, not in a way of trauma, but more about the quiet ways that it shows up just in normal everyday life. And it doesn't have to mean just in the context of romantic relationships, because usually when people hear attachment styles, they tend to think about relationships and dating and conflict and these huge triggers and emotional moments that feel really hard for you to come back to yourself. And sometimes it is that, but sometimes it's also just the very small ways that it shows up in how we respond to things and the ways that we can sometimes process information, or sometimes even the narrative that we might tell ourselves about what the person might mean or their intention towards you. It can even be in something as small as how quickly you might reply to a text message, or how much you might try to over-explain a text message, or even what you might make of someone not replying to your texts quick enough, and just misinterpreting the tone and the language that can sometimes be used over texting. It can also be related to how comfortable or even how uncomfortable you feel around taking rest and perhaps asking for help and trying to relax and not being able to do that without feeling guilty. And it can also be about how you not only manage yourself, but how you also manage other people. So for a lot of women who are more high functioning and more self-aware, attachment doesn't feel like being unsafe. They wouldn't necessarily name it as that, but it would feel like not being able to relax, not being able to switch off, having a very busy mind, feeling as though you're almost waiting for something or the next chaotic thing or the next disruptive thing to happen. It's almost like you're always firefighting and you're always expecting the worst to happen. There's quite often a feeling of being tired but not really being able to rest. And so no matter how much sleep you might get, you might always wake up with this feeling of not really feeling fully rested. And so that's just a little bit of what I'm talking about today. And it's not about what is wrong with you. It is not about how challenging or difficult you can find relationships, but it's more about learning how your nervous system has learned how to keep connection and how it's felt for you to keep those coping mechanisms going so that life can feel manageable. And so I talked a little bit already about just messaging and like rereading texts, for example, when a message comes through, and sometimes overthinking the tone or reading it in a way that it's not intended, or just feeling really unsettled and uneasy and expecting the worst if someone hasn't replied yet. Maybe on the surface that can look like being thoughtful or being polite, but for a lot of people, especially with anxious attachment, that lack of speed often means that something bad has happened. And so when you're looking to have that quicker response, it's because you're looking for that feeling of safety. Your nervous system can almost tell you that if you stay available, if you stay free, then that means I can stay connected. And so obviously when someone isn't responding to you as quickly as you would like, it's feeling as though they are not in connection with you. And if you're interpreting it as someone is being disconnected or you're not in connection with someone, that is what can bring up those fearful feelings of something bad has happened to them, or they're not interested in me anymore, or I've said something to upset them. Because somewhere along the way, you staying somewhat emotionally switched on, that is the way that you've always been able to feel secure. And so if somebody or if you're perceiving somebody as being more distant, that's where those feelings of insecurity come up. And it doesn't mean that you're super anxious and that you're super needy in your relationships. Not necessarily. There is context that's needed here, but it does mean that your nervous system has learned that connection works better when you stay almost on high alert rather than just staying connected. And another way that I've seen how attachment comes up in everyday issues is the ability or the inability to relax and recognize when your body needs rest and when to take that rest without feeling guilty and without feeling as though you have to be productive, or that needing rest means that you're failing in some way, or that you're not doing enough. You're not coping in the same way that other people are coping because you're tired. And for some reason, there's some kind of story sometimes that you can tell yourself that you shouldn't feel tired, or what have you done in order to, almost like you have to earn rest as opposed to just listening to what your body might need. Sometimes we can tie our value and our self-worth into how productive or unproductive we are. And so if we feel like we're not doing as much, or we don't have as much energy as what we think we should have, we can tie that into like a negative perception of, oh, I'm lazy, or everyone else has got it figured out and I'm just, I'm lazy, I'm unproductive, I have to earn my right to rest. Or you might even think that you're bad at relaxing, you're not really good at doing it. And again, that can be like another nervous system indication that your nervous system has learned that safety is through doing and being productive, and you don't get that sense of safety by being still or by resting. And maybe that also comes from some of the patterns that you've seen around you, and sometimes that can be seeing your parents constantly, and it might not be because that's what they want to do, it might be because they had no other choice, but maybe they also couldn't prioritize rest. Maybe they were in a state of having to constantly provide for the family, and so rest was almost seen as something of an indulgence. It wasn't really seen as something that is a necessity. So the idea of sitting down, reading a book, or just sitting and having a cup of tea, that's like, oh, okay, we've got things to do. We've got to keep a roof over our heads. We have to work. We have to stay busy. And while, yes, being busy and productive has its place, so does rest and recuperation. And sometimes when we are constantly living in our stress response and in our survival responses of having to earn more, having to work, having to be busy and do all of the things to, just for survival, it's wired into our nervous systems that actually perhaps the times when you slow down and the times when you are less productive, that is what feels unsafe. And that can be a deeper reason why when you take maybe like a week off of work, or you go on holiday and you have a vacation and you think, well, having the holiday, that will help, right? That will help to reset, that will help me to relax. But then what you might find is that you go on holiday and it actually takes quite a bit of time for you to be able to switch off. And so by the time you have managed to kind of relax and start to ease more into the holiday, before you know it, it's already time to come home, and you've taken, you've got 2 weeks off and it's taken you about 10 days for you to switch off. Then once you've switched off, if you've even managed to switch off, it's already time to go back to work. And so sometimes when you're going back, it doesn't feel like you've rested enough, or it doesn't really feel like a holiday. It doesn't feel like recuperation. It doesn't feel like a nervous system reset, or that you've been able to kind of switch off your brain. It just doesn't feel like much rest has really happened. It's not that it's your schedule that is keeping you tired. It's your nervous system hasn't been able to relax, and it hasn't been able to feel safety in being able to relax. I hope that makes sense. And then another way that attachment can show up in everyday kind of living is in how you ask for help or how you don't ask for help. And so women who are, well, I say women, this podcast is aimed at women, but this podcast, you could be a man listening to this as well. But sometimes people who are very high functioning and very capable and very self-sufficient, maybe you might have some borderline avoidant traits, or maybe you just have a lot of hyper independence where you don't really like to ask for help and you like to be self-reliant and you don't like to rely on other people for support, because you have done that in the past and you've probably grown up in an environment where you've had to learn and figure things out on your own. So anytime you have had a problem, or you have been upset about something, or you've needed some kind of parental advice or parental support, emotional support, it hasn't felt like it was there. You haven't quite had the support that you needed, and you haven't felt like you've been held and that you've been given guidance. And because of that, you've had to really figure it out on your own, of if you're feeling a certain way, how do you then manage that by yourself? And if you have a problem, how do you problem solve your way out of that? Rather than being able to rely on a parent or having a support network or a support system, you've almost had to become your own support system. And so when that happens, it can make it really difficult for you to recognize when you need support, because you're so used to being very self-focused and almost going inwards and internalizing when you're going through a hard time, that it doesn't even occur to you that support is available, or that you have access to people who are willing and more than able and more than willing to support you or to offer some kind of assistance. You almost forget that outside support exists because you're so used to having to do that on your own. And so even though you can cope with certain things on your own, and it's not a bad thing necessarily to be very self-sufficient, but it most definitely can have its limitations if you're feeling isolated, for example, in your relationships, or there's almost like this silent resentment of, oh my gosh, everything always has to come down to me. It's always me that has to figure all of this stuff out. And so when you have that feeling of resentment and feeling like almost you would love it if you could let go of having to be in control of everything and having to figure everything out and being the problem solver and the fixer for everything and everyone, including yourself, it's a sign that maybe you've been over functioning in that sense of not reaching and using the community and the resources and the support of the people that you have around you. Because that's also a really important part of relationships and also relational healing. Because if we've had experiences of being let down in relationships, quite often the most powerful way that we can rebuild and repair a lot of those relational attachment wounds is through having healthier relationships and having healthier, stronger connections, because we actually heal our attachment ruptures through relationships. A lot of attachment focuses on romantic love and romantic situations and how the attachment patterns show up in a romantic lens, but it is more than just about who you love. Your attachment patterns are also about how you live. And it's about how you move through your days and the ways that you show up, not only in a romantic context, but it's also in your friendships. It's also in the ways that you parent. It's also in your other family relationships. It's also in your relationships to money. So there are so many different ways that our belief systems around our attachments show up, that it's not just about love and dating. It can also be about the way that we love ourselves and the type of relationships that we have with ourselves. And so if you are someone who is very self-critical and your inner critic often is very harsh and is very judgmental and is very unforgiving if you make a mistake or if you are not performing at your best, that can also be a sign of the type of relationship that you have with yourself and the fact that there is some form of insecure attachment there to the relationship that you have with yourself, that there isn't almost an inner safety or an inner self-trust that you have. So there is this protective kind of version that thinks it's doing its best by being self-critical and trying to hold you accountable, but there is a difference between being held accountable in a loving way and someone just being a critic and an inner critic. And quite often your inner critic can be a bit of a prick, to be honest with you, a bit of a bitch, and say, all the negative, harmful, unpleasant things that really you would never say out loud to another person, but you might not notice that you say it a lot to yourself. And that is a lot of what the internal monologue or the internal thoughts that you have whenever you feel like you're not doing enough or you're not being enough or you're just having a moment of doubt. So if you also notice that the internal thoughts that you have are, very self-deprecating, or sometimes it's in such a small way that you don't realize it, like, oh, I'm just being stupid. I'm so silly. I can't believe I did that. What an idiot. All of those kind of things, all of those messages, if that's the kind of internal process that you have when you make a mistake, that can also relate to almost like a relational wound that has happened somewhere along the lines. And so it's now coming out as this inner critic. And sometimes that inner critic can be the internalized voice of perhaps a critical parent. But sometimes it's about an attachment rupture and a reflection of the kind of relationship that we have with ourselves when our self-worth isn't maybe as strong as what it could be, because we're not showing ourselves the kind of compassion and the kind of love that comes from having a secure attachment. This was just a few ideas just to, I suppose, get you to reflect somewhat on if there are any attachment wounds that you might have that might be showing up in your day-to-day, and thinking about, well, where might some of these patterns be coming from? And it's helping you to kind of practice safer ways of being able to relate and being more conscious of when you need to ask for help and being able to receive that help and being able to be not only with yourself but also with others. And sometimes your attachment patterns aren't necessarily very loud and obvious. Sometimes it's also the underlying things that we just assume just makes up a part of our character and who we are, when sometimes it can be coming from a much more deeper rooted place of attachment wounds or insecurity or an attachment or a relationship rupture that we haven't tended to. Once you start noticing it more, your life can become not as stressful, and you can be, I suppose, somewhat more mindful and more reflective and more intentional about how you respond to things and the ways that you want to show up in your relationships, and also how you can start to do things and move in the world that little bit differently, and perhaps in a more connected, grounded, secure way. And that's also a lot of the work that I do in therapy as well. So if you are interested in working with me and you are based in the UK and in the EU, there is a link in the show notes if you want to learn more about working with me, or you can follow me on Instagram and send me a DM, and I would be happy to share information with you about one-to-one therapy. Okay, that's it for today's episode. I will catch you in the next one. Bye. Thank you for joining this episode of Healing Childhood Trauma. I hope you found today's discussion insightful and empowering. Remember, healing is a journey and you are not alone on this path. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, rate, and leave a review on your favourite podcast platform. And you can share this episode with a friend. Your feedback helps this podcast to reach more women who are ready to heal and build secure, healthy relationships and heal from the past.